Welcome back to Silicon Wafers. Today we follow the full spectrum of stories from Ukraine's legal and righteous fight to eject the invader and gain dominance of the Black Sea to the unfolding illegality in the Caribbean. And we examine whether war is becoming a likely option for an embattled US president to deflect and distract from his domestic woes and scandals. In this episode, we range from Odesa to Caracas, from Kyiv to Washington, and investigate the startling withdrawal of some intelligence support by the British for the US, once considered a staunch ally, fearing they'd become implicated in illegal and arbitrary acts of murder in the Caribbean as Trump's war against the so-called traffickers and gangs ramps up in international waters. Before we jump in, thanks to everyone who supports the channel, especially through Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. Your assistance is incredibly valuable, especially as we are gearing up to do the final events of the year. And it's only with your support that we can make those happen. So here are today's stories in this episode. 3 converging storms. Firstly, the UK has quietly paused some intelligence sharing with the United States over lethal drug boat strikes near Venezuela. 2, Moscow is talking about parking its new Oreshnik hypersonic missiles in Venezuela. Americans may be in for surprises, says one Russian lawmaker. 3, and in Washington, the Epstein Files scandal is detonating around Donald Trump, raising the grim question, would a weakened president start a foreign war as a distraction? All this loops back to Ukraine, Russia, and of course lurking in the background, China. The special relationship hits a legal tripwire. We start in the Caribbean. Since September, the Trump administration has been running what it sells as a new hardline war on narco-terrorism. US warships and aircraft hunting small boats near the Venezuelan coast and blowing them out of the water with missiles. At least a dozen boats have been hit and more than 70 people killed, according to UK and US media reports. That's in The Guardian. In fact, today the estimate is at 77. That's the latest count. With no due process, no evidence provided as to their guilt. These are extrajudicial killings based on suspicion, not evidence. Total impunity. And a stark illustration of the new principles of this new world disorder, that is, might makes right. Many of those on board those boats are accused drug smugglers. Some, of course, may be civilians. Almost none are getting any kind of trial. On 11th November 2025, The Guardian revealed that Britain has suspended intelligence sharing with the US on suspected drug trafficking vessels in the Caribbean because London fears that UK-supplied intel is being used to conduct unlawful killings at sea. That is from The Guardian. A small sentence in that report has huge diplomatic implications. British officials say their long-standing policy is not to share intelligence if there's a real risk it will be used in ways that breach international law. If the UK has paused that flow of intel, even partly, it means that London no longer trusts that these US strikes are legal. The Financial Times and others confirm that this is not a total breakdown of the Five Eyes monitoring network. The pause is narrow and specific, focused on this one campaign against alleged drug boats. But symbolically, it's huge. The UK quietly telling its closest ally, we think you may be breaking the law. And it implies fears of at least the risk of future criminal accusations or proceedings against the US, which the UK would not want to be implicated in. That's from the Financial Times. In public, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has pushed back hard. He told reporters at the G7 there has been no change in intelligence cooperation and dismissed reports of a UK pause as a false story. So says Reuters, but British officials aren't really denying it. Downing Street is just falling back on the old "we don't comment on intelligence matters" line while refusing to say the reports are wrong. That was reported in ITVX. And it's not just Britain. Colombia has also also suspended intelligence sharing with the US over the same boat strikes, with President Gustavo Petro saying he won't help if Washington is blowing up boats with unknown occupants. That's reported in Reuters. Now, you may ask why we care so much, and you may suggest that this has no implications at all for Ukraine or even for US domestic policies. But I suggest that impunity, illegality, and violence in one area encourages the same in others. I draw a direct line between the impunity and illegality we see in international waters and the activities of ICE on US streets, which also suggests creeping impunity and total disregard for due process, rule of law, and any concept of human and civic rights. What's happening in this legal and maritime grey zone? According to Sky News and CNN, US forces have carried out around 14 to 19 strikes on small vessels since September, often targeting boats at night, far offshore, based on signals intelligence and aerial surveillance rather than clear identification of individuals or any kind of evidence of wrongdoing, so says the Sky News. The Trump administration insists these are legitimate military actions against narco-terrorists, people it treats as a hybrid of cartel, militia, and terrorist group. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth has openly compared the campaign to raids on al-Qaeda, so says the Financial Times. But as we'll recall, there was huge controversy around the detention and incarceration of many individuals during the War on Terror, and allegations of extrajudicial torture and lack of due process or adherence to international law. And in this case too, human rights lawyers and military law experts are pointing to a big problem. There is no declared war in this Caribbean action, no clear battlefield, and almost no transparency about who was on these boats. If you fire a missile at a vessel whose occupants you haven't reliably identified in waters that are not recognized as a war zone, then you are in very murky legal waters indeed. British lawyers warn that UK personnel who help track or target those boats could, in theory, be personally liable if the strikes are later judged unlawful. That's the same logic that pushed the UK to limit cooperation over US rendition and torture after 9/11. That's according to Financial Times. Britain isn't just a distant observer here. It has overseas territories. It has intelligence assets and Royal Navy patrols in the Caribbean. It also has a British officer embedded on a US warship in the region. If that ship is firing missiles based on intelligence that Britain helped to collect, then Westminster has a legal and an ethical problem. This is according to The Guardian. And why does this matter for Ukraine and Russia? Because this is potentially a flagrant diversion from the Western security architecture based on maritime conventions, rule of law, international law, and due process that Moscow will exploit immediately. Not that they care about international law or institutions, and indeed are diligently working to undermine them, but they will point out the hypocrisy of Western nations with glee, especially as they view most members of the Western Alliance and NATO to simply be puppets of the US in any case. On the 1st of November 2025, Russia's foreign ministry condemned the US campaign as excessive military force and a violation of both US law and international law, while loudly reaffirming support for Venezuela's government. That's from Reuters, and perhaps is an indicator that irony is truly dead in the 21st century. And this is classic Kremlin propaganda framing. Paint the US as a rogue power, blowing up civilians on flimsy pretexts, pose as the sober defender of sovereignty and international law while you're illegally occupying parts of Ukraine. Accuse your adversaries of that which you are carrying out yourself, of imperialism, with claims that you are the historical friend of the oppressed and colonized, while engaging in an imperial war against Ukraine and decimating your own ethnic minorities in the meat grinder that you've created. And now the Kremlin can point to something concrete. Even Britain, America's closest ally, is worried enough to turn off part of that intel tap because of the risk of perceived complicity in criminal acts of violence. That's not just propaganda fodder, it feeds into real strategic risk. An America that no longer feels bound by conventions and law, and which is blatant in its disregard of the advice and concerns of allies, but one which may be less inclined to listen to reason or even less inclined to be supportive on issues such as Ukraine, Greenland, and other areas of contention and instability. There is a real risk of America going fully and unilaterally rogue. Which brings us to Venezuela and a Russian missile named Oreshnik. Oreshnik is Moscow's hazelnut in the Caribbean. While Washington is blowing up boats, Russia is moving pieces of its own on the Latin American chessboard. Over the last month, multiple reports have confirmed that Moscow has delivered fresh air defense systems to Venezuela, including Pantsir S-1 and Buk M2E batteries, on top of the S-300 VM systems that are already there. A senior Russian lawmaker, Alexei Zhuralyov, bragged that these were flown in on an Ilyushin 76 transport aircraft. That's according to Business Insider. That alone would be significant, but Zhuralyov went further. Speaking to Russian media, he said, "I see no obstacles to supplying a friendly country with new developments such as the Oreshnik." That's from the Kyiv Post. He also warned that the Americans may be in for surprises because the exact types and volumes of weapons being sent are classified. So is this bluster and bluff? Is he taunting the Americans, or is it a genuine attempt at deterrence? Let's unpack the various claims. Oreshnik is Russia's new intermediate-range nuclear-capable ballistic missile, the one that the Kremlin has been hyping as a hypersonic game-changer. It has reportedly been tested once in combat in a strike on the Ukrainian city of Dnipro last year. Analysts at the Kyiv Post and independent OSINT researchers who looked at satellite imagery after that strike found surprisingly modest physical damage on the ground, given the hype, suggesting the weapon is still experimental or used in a limited configuration. In fact, it was claimed afterwards that it may have not had any warheads installed. That's from Kyiv Post. Western media, like the Times in London, reported that President Zelensky has said the missile's range is just over 3,000 miles. That is long enough to hit most of Europe from Russia itself or from Belarusian territory, and long enough to threaten parts of the US mainland if placed in Latin America. So could this be a modern-day Cuban missile crisis? On the 4th of November, Kyiv Post ran a piece headlined, "Americans may be in for surprises. Russian lawmaker suggests that Moscow might arm Venezuela with Oreshnik missiles." The article makes the stakes explicit. Zhuralyov is effectively floating a mini Caribbean missile crisis, using Oreshnik as leverage to deter any US attack on Nicolas Maduro's regime. That's according to Kyiv Post. And other outlets, from Newsweek to defense site The War Zone and Ukrainian military portal Militarny, have picked up the same theme. Russia is openly considering sending either Oreshnik ballistic missiles or Kalibr cruise missiles to Venezuela, while confirming the delivery of air defense systems and boasting of Venezuela's growing Russian equipment air force. That's from Newsweek. And it's not happening in a vacuum. In May, Putin and Maduro signed a strategic partnership agreement, expanding cooperation in energy, mining, and military technical fields. That's from Atlantic Council. Since August, the US has answered by deploying its biggest naval force in the Caribbean since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The carrier USS General R. Ford, other warships, aircraft, and thousands of troops, ostensibly for anti-drug operations. That's according to the Times. Experts point out, however, that these platforms are never normally deployed for such operations, and if deployed for these reasons alone, represent something that amounts to massive overkill. But what is Russia really doing here? Signaling versus the reality. On one level, this is classic nuclear theatre. Nuclear theatre, which of course Russia has been operating throughout the full-scale war against Ukraine. It cost Moscow almost nothing to let a Duma hawk talk on TV about sending hypersonic nukes to Venezuela. It cost Washington quite a lot. Suddenly, every US hawk is screaming about another Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Pentagon feels pressure to reinforce an already huge presence. Well, that could result in a bill of deterrence and armament amounting to many billions of dollars. An excellent analysis from the Atlantic Council points out that Russia's actual capacity to bail out Maduro is limited in the way he was unable to save Assad. He was also severely limited in that capacity too. The war in Ukraine is burning through Russian missiles, cash, and attention span. Moscow has already scaled back some expensive overseas commitments, most dramatically in Syria, though that one wasn't, of course, out of choice. That's from Atlantic Council. And symbolism here matters. Seen from Kyiv, Areshnik for Venezuela is a concerning move. It threatens the US homeland from the south, trying to inject nuclear anxiety into American domestic politics and complicate decision-making over Ukraine. It ties down US assets, carriers, aircraft, ISR platforms in the Caribbean that could otherwise deter Russia, support Ukraine, or reassure European allies. This is why Ukrainian analysts keep stressing that every theatre is connected, every place in the world that Russia operates, and its puppets, such as Wagner, is a potential flashpoint and a battleground for projection of military force, influence, and struggle for resources. The same Kiev Post article by Katerina Zakharchenko notes that Venezuela has also reached out to China and Iran for drones, radar, and electronic warfare support, weaving a mini axis of Russia, China, Iran around the Americas. So claims Kiev Post. And Russian state media are already drawing the parallels that they love to emphasize. They say if NATO can put missiles near Russia's border, why can't Russia do the same near the US? The analogy is dishonest. Ukraine never hosted nuclear-capable missiles pointing at Moscow, and indeed the US bent over backwards in the 1990s to ensure that the fledgling Ukrainian state was stripped of its nuclear arsenal and its nuclear superpower potential. But of course, this line is still powerful propaganda, and it works in some so-called Global South territories, as does the line about Moscow being a colonial liberator and not an imperial repressor of historic proportions. So how worried should we be? Here are a few sobering realities. Reshnik is not fielded in large numbers. Western intelligence and Ukrainian analysts agree we're talking about a handful of prototypes, not hundreds of missiles. That's from the Kiev Post. Deploying even a few of these to Venezuela would be logistically complex and politically escalatory. It would tie Russia into defending Maduro against a vastly superior US military in America's near abroad. It might even risk those missiles falling into American hands. It would also make Russian launch crews and hardware a target on Venezuelan soil, not obviously something that Moscow wants while it's already overstretched, overreached in Ukraine. For now, most experts see Areshnik talk as nuclear-flavoured blackmail, not an imminent deployment. But here's the catch. Deterrence signalling can spiral out of control. If Trump feels cornered over domestic scandals, or if some in his circle start to see taking out Maduro as good political optics, the temptation is to show resolve in the Caribbean and to brush off Russian threats as bluff. Well, that brings us to the third storm, the third story in this episode. The Epstein Files, diversionary war, and the Venezuela question. In Washington, another story is colliding with the Caribbean standoff. Over the past few months, the US Justice Department and Congress have been locked in a grim tug-of-war over the Epstein Files. Tens of thousands of pages of documents, emails, and records tied to the late convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein and his network. On 27th of February 2025, Attorney General Pam Bondi announced the first phase of declassified Epstein files. Expectations on the right of American politics was sky high. Talk of secret client lists and explosive compromat. The reality was far more mundane. Partial document dumps, heavily redacted, with many key materials still withheld. Well, some of those details are taken from Department of Justice announcements. Since then, the House Oversight Committee has prized loose more material from the DOJ, over 20,000 pages in the latest tranche alone, according to The Guardian and Sky News. But that may still be a fraction of the total cache of files, emails, audio, and video. Commentators from Politico to Axios describe this as a perfectly timed political bomb. It hits just as Trump is facing backlash over recent government shutdown and the drug boat strikes, and growing unease among some Republicans about his Venezuela strategy, so says Politico. Inside Trump's base, there's fury, not so much that the Epstein files are being released, but that they don't match the myth so far. There is no neat client list wiping out all of Trump's enemies, no Hollywood script revelation that vindicates every conspiracy theory that's done the rounds over the last couple of years. That's from Business Insider. He might take us to war. Some US politicians are saying the quiet part out loud. In an interview flagged by US media, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker warned that Trump might take us to war with Venezuela just to get a distraction in the news and take Epstein out of the headlines. That was reported in Yahoo News. On cable news and podcasts, military analysts and former officials are reviving a familiar concept, diversionary war theory, the idea that embattled leaders sometimes reach for external conflict to rally domestic support and distract from scandals. That's taken from Wikipedia. And of course, Putin's endless war making provides quite a classic example of that behavior. The Caribbean situation arguably already fits the lower end diversionary pattern. The US has escalated from maritime interdiction to lethal missile strikes on boats, killing dozens, far from any declared battlefield. That's in The Guardian. The White House is selling it as a decisive, almost cinematic campaign against narco terrorists. Crucially, it is visibly shifting the media narrative away from Epstein and towards Trump as commander in chief. Does that mean that Trump will start a war with Venezuela as a distraction? We just don't know. What we can do is map the constraints and the risks. So here are some of the constraints on a wider war. One is the military reality. Even with carriers and bombers on station, Venezuela isn't Iraq in 2003. It has layered Russian air defenses, a difficult geography, and support from Moscow, Tehran, and economically Beijing. US generals know that a full-scale campaign could be costly and could potentially be prolonged. That's Business Insider. Point two, Congress and public opinion. There is deep skepticism in both parties about another regime change adventure. Even in this alternate 2025, you can hear echoes of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya in congressional hearings. Three, there's nuclear signaling. Once you have Russian officials openly musing about putting nuclear-capable missiles in Venezuela and Cuba, escalation risks become very real. Well, that's from online HuffPost. And point four, Europe and Ukraine. European allies are already unhappy about the drug boat strikes and the intel pause. They know that a major US-Venezuela war would pull attention and assets away from Ukraine and hand Putin exactly the kind of distraction that he desperately wants at this time. That's from The Guardian. But again, the risks are real. You don't need a full-scale war for diversionary logic to be dangerous. A single US strike on Venezuelan territory, say on an alleged cartel training camp, could kill many civilians, trigger a Venezuelan retaliation, and invite Russian advisors to get involved. A near-miss incident between Russian and US aircraft or ships in the Caribbean could generate pressure on both sides to show strength. A misinterpreted Oreshnik movement, even a test or a decoy, could spark panic in Washington. From Kyiv's point of view, all of that is bad news. It dilutes Western focus, makes Trump more tempted to trade Ukraine away in some grand bargain, and gives Russia a second theatre in which to brandish its new toys and deploy coercive threats, including nuclear threats, and activate proxies to target American forces and maritime assets. Russian propagandists are already doing the preparation for just this thing. Ukrainian outlets have flagged Russian talk shows fantasizing about a scenario where Oreshnik missiles in Venezuela force the US to the table to discuss not just Latin America, but a security guarantee for Russia in Europe, and indeed maybe even an entire revision of European security architecture. That is from Kyiv Post. So how does all this loop back to Ukraine? Well, in the Caribbean, the US is running a legally dubious drug boat war that's killed more than 70 people and pushed Britain and Colombia to partly turn off the intelligence tap. In Venezuela, Russia is upgrading Maduro's air defenses and flirting with sending Oreshnik hypersonic missiles and Caliber cruise missiles, a move that would symbolically reverse the missile pressure from Europe to America's own backyard. That's in Business Insider. In Washington, the Epstein files are dragging Trump back into a scandal he cannot fully control, with emails and potentially more being let out of the bag. The political incentive to change the subject to project strength is obvious. That's from The Guardian. So let's summarize these. One, Britain's partial suspension of intelligence sharing isn't betrayal of the alliance. It's an attempt to keep Western foreign policy tethered to international law. If democracies stop doing that, they will lose the moral and political ground against Russia's overt aggression in Ukraine, lose their case to the global community that sovereign and human rights have primacy and are the main objective of Western foreign policy. Two, Russia's talk of Oreshnik for Venezuela is not some remote Latin American subplot. It's part of the same playbook we see in Ukraine. Escalate, brandish nuclear adjacent capabilities, and try to fracture Western unity, all while insisting Russia is just reacting to Western hysteria. Or so says Kyiv Post. This could become the third front after China and the Pacific, Russia in Europe, and now in the US's own backyard, which of course it may come to see as a greater existential threat. And thirdly, lastly, the Epstein files are a reminder that corruption, abuse, and impunity at home weaken democracy abroad. A president consumed by personal scandal is more likely to reach for theatrical foreign policy moves and less likely to hold a consistent line in support of Ukraine, a line which we have to say was already inconsistent enough and lacking any clear outcomes. If you're listening in Europe, in North America, wherever, and you care about Ukraine's survival, about resisting authoritarianism, about stopping Russia from redrawing borders by force, then you must also care about what happens off the coast of Venezuela, in unspoken policies in Washington and in legally dubious acts of violence in the Caribbean, because from Moscow's perspective, it's all one war and the objectives of Moscow are still the same. They remain the erasure of Ukraine, the destruction of NATO in the EU, and, if they can achieve it, the fall of American democratic strength.
Бажаємо міцного здоров'я. Ми бійці батальйону безпілотних систем Black Raven 93-ї бригади Холодний Яр виконуємо бойове завдання на Константинівському напрямку в Донецькій області. Для їх успішного виконання наш підрозділ має потребу в пікапах для виїзду особового складу на позиції, евакуації, своєчасного підвозу боєприпасів, дронів та обладнання в район ведення бойових дій. Звертаємося до YouTube-спільноти Silicon Curtain та Джонатана особисто з проханням допомогти підтримати збір, а також до Car for Ukraine та Бандера Мобіль з проханням допомогти з купівлею, підготовкою та доставкою авто на фронт. Слава Україні!
Героям слава!